Out of all of the games I've ever played in my life, Baldur's Gate 3 is without a doubt one of the greatest. It essentially combined my two favorite genres, that being role-playing games and immersive sims, and molded them into one coherent package that is as deep as it is wide, with hundreds of hours of super high-quality content that all results in what I would consider the best RPG ever made. However, for as great as the title is, as I've played it more and more, and have had now a few months to think back on all of my thoughts and gather myself, I do think that in some ways, there are things that could be even better, that myself and many others have looked past, especially on initial release. First of all, one thing I really did press on in my original review of the game before it launched was that the characters were way too sexual. I understand wanting to have romantic options in games and making a connection with your favorite character, but in my opinion, literally no game has ever pulled this off right, except for save one, Cyberpunk 2077, and Baldur's Gate 3 is no exception. When every single one of my party members wants to fornicate with me with almost no effort, it almost feels cheap, and in a way, it takes away some of the sophistication from these characters. Another example is how so many of the companions are pansexual too. No matter what gender or type of character I pick, whether that be a giant lizard man or a tiny gnome girl, everyone is down to engage in bedtime activities at all times. It makes these characters feel less like people and more like computer-generated NPCs, and also makes the relationships feel so unrealistic, where rather than having preferences like in real life where people would deny me if they aren't into me, everyone just wants it. Real love is the work you have to put in and the struggles you went through together to find peace, not just lust and trying to gamify taking each other to bed. And while it's okay to have some characters like that, when your entire ensemble is so horny, it just feels weird. But even more than that, after all these months, another thing that's really bothered me now about the newest entry in the Baldur's Gate series is the world building and story. You see, I've always been a sucker for great worlds and stories in games, and it's why I find those things so much more fascinating than, say, characters usually, because the ideas that make me think and light my imagination on fire with possibilities are so much more intriguing to me than just decently written fake people. And in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, thinking back on the game now, and after going back to it a couple times months later, the story and world really weren't as interesting as I remembered. The entire main plot of getting a worm out of your head is cool at first, but because of the scope of the world, the pacing often comes to a halt where I would often forget what my main objective even was, or that there was a tadpole crawling around in my brain. And when you combine that with characters that for the most part don't stand out as much as greats from other games, you are left with an adventure that, while fun, lacks the same sense of purpose that I've felt in other games. But I also want to stop here to remind everyone watching this, I still would say Baldur's Gate 3 is the greatest RPG ever made. The amount of choice and consequence, a world that radically realizes what the player does, and hundreds of ways to tackle any situation that makes actually playing the game so engaging, it's hard to argue otherwise. It's just that in retrospect, I think the story and characters could have been handled so much better. The way in which the plot unfolds, the stakes at play, and how characters connect with the world just never reaches the highs of many other great RPGs. For example, after beating the game, I wouldn't say I was especially interested in watching videos on lore of the series, like I was after beating, say, Mass Effect, Cyberpunk, or Dragon Age. And when you have just out-of-pocket scenes like this with the Emperor, where he tries to be romantic with you, it just feels so off in Baldur's Gate 3. I get that the game is based on D&D, and part of the tabletop experience is wacky things like this, but when one of your main villains breaks character this hard and tries to become a love interest, even if for nefarious means, it just feels cheap and honestly kind of weird. For me, it took all of the stakes out of the experience, forcing me to play for the unbelievably great gameplay and RPG systems rather than a story I can really connect with. When I play something like, say, Dragon Age or Mass Effect, I'm utterly captivated at all times trying to learn about the world, what went on in the past, and just getting immersed with everything around me. But with Baldur's Gate 3, I'm just kind of having fun and not taking it that seriously, because the game doesn't take itself that seriously. So in other words, while Baldur's Gate 3 is utterly amazing, and I truly mean that, one of the greatest games ever made full stop, over time, I definitely have soured a little bit on it as well, and don't regard it as nearly perfect like I did before. And that doesn't mean I don't think Larian are some of the best in the business, and for a huge part of the community, the writing in Baldur's Gate 3 and the companions and story is exactly what they wanted. But for me, I would love to see something a little more grounded and serious, with companions and a world that feels better and more fleshed out. Give me the systems of a Larian game with the writing and world building of an old school BioWare title. Because with that, you're essentially talking about the perfect game. And if anyone can do that, it's Larian, or maybe CD Projekt Red. The first time I ever played Red Dead Redemption 2, if I'm being completely honest, I was bored out of my mind. The snow level and slowly going through each tutorial mission was so painful that despite trying the game over 5 times, no matter what, during or just after the snow level, I would finally put my controller down and just give up. Despite how beautiful it was, despite how good the animations were, actually playing Red Dead 2 was so agonizing and frustrating that I just didn't even want to deal with it. On a couple of my later playthroughs, I would even make it more hours into the main story and through a few missions, but every time I would once again get bored and give up. I was skipping cutscenes, not connecting with any of the characters, and overall, I was just not having a good time. For some reason, this industry darling just never seemed to hit for me, where everything that was supposed to be immersive fell flat and proved tedious instead. And I know this actually is fairly common from what I've seen online. Despite how beloved Red Dead Redemption 2 is, tons of people still find it painfully boring, and many never even get to see what the game offers besides the slow introduction. But somehow, some way, this game kept pulling me back over and over again. And only on one of my much later playthroughs, when I decided to actually dedicate the time to play through the main story and wider game, did I realize why it's one of the best ever made. You see, Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't a shooter, it isn't an RPG, and despite being an open world, really it's unlike anything else out there. It's very slow, methodical, and while it takes forever to get going, by the end it will have you in tears and really show you how powerful storytelling in games can be. While other games try to constantly keep you engaged, Red Dead simply offered a world that is as immersive as they come, and beckons you to slowly dive deeper into it. The whole reason I finally started to even love this title is that I finally met it at its own pace. Instead of trying to rush through missions and reach objectives, I just took my time, wandering around the environment, hunting deer in the wild for food, and spending hours in my camp talking to everyone to get to know them better. And it's when you play Red Dead 2 like this that it truly shines. The writing on offer here is unmatched, the storytelling is riveting and raw, and the characters feel so harsh yet loving at the same time. Arthur's journey is one about redemption, about a man born into unfortunate circumstances who kills and pillages for those he holds close, learning to shed his jarring skin and be birthed into something new, an analogy to the Wild West dying out before his very eyes as well. And going on this journey with Arthur is one of the most powerful narratives in games out there. And I look back and think how funny it is that I used to hate this game, because despite the flaws at its core, it's one of the most important tales we can experience about growing up and sacrificing for those around us. And when you combine that with top-of-the-line immersive elements, once this game has you under its spell, it never lets go. Walking around your camp at night and seeing the embers of a crackling fire disperse into the air as you hear the rumblings from your family about your recent missions, or sifting your way through a babbling brook as the sounds of birds and rainfall in the distance fill your room, is something that no other games offer quite to this level. And I'm not saying I think the game is perfect by any means. It has so many flaws. It's still boring as ever at times, movement and upgrade mechanics feel horrible to me, and the early sections are a complete slog. In fact, if I'm being honest, a game like Cyberpunk 2077 is miles and miles better than Red Dead Redemption 2, but I'd be lying if I said Red Dead wasn't amazing now that I've given it more of a chance. Because Red Dead is a world full of characters and even random NPCs and towns that feel genuine, real, and act like actual downtrodden folks in the Old West, simply doing the best they can to survive. It's the type of game you might not always be in the mood for, and if I'm being frank, I don't know if I ever actually want to play it again. I would just get too bored. But if you are in the right mood and willing to really take your time with this title, not rushing through each mission or just trying to get the best guns, then this is one of the greatest stories ever told in the game's medium and provides a sense of place in a world that is unmatched by any other games even years later. So without a doubt, I was wrong about Red Dead Redemption 2. Because despite how long it took to grab me, it tells a story and has some very poignant moments that might just make it hard to forget ever. And that's more powerful than any good gameplay, fun introduction, or more engaging movement systems could ever be. It's one of the greatest stories ever told in a game, with some of the highest emotions I've ever felt experiencing art. And that's something that's really special. There aren't many games out there more beloved than Elden Ring, and for good reason. It's one of the most expansive and awe-inspiring games ever made. It has immaculate gameplay and a huge variety of playstyles, and an art design that is truly breathtaking. So much so that when I first beat the game, I was taken aback by just how much I enjoyed it because of so many memorable boss fights, cool hidden areas and secrets, and a world that you can truly get lost in. There's a reason Elden Ring is so beloved and one of the highest rated games of all time. And because I personally had never played a FromSoft game before Elden Ring, the formula was entirely new to me, which made it even more exciting. But the thing is, over time, my opinion of Elden Ring has only continued to sour, where now I still see it as one of the best games ever made, but on my own personal list, it might not even be in the top 10. And while I know this isn't a popular discussion to have, I still want to be honest and explain why. Even though Elden Ring fans are by far the most rabid out there I've seen and will attack anyone who doesn't love this game, hopefully I can provide some clear reasons as to why. You see, since I first completed Elden Ring, I have not only gone back and played some other FromSoft titles, but I have also gone back and tried to play Elden Ring again as well, especially for the DLC. And I've slowly come to the realization that I actually have a lot of issues with the game too. First of all, because of Elden Ring's massive scale and scope, a lot of things are copy-pasted. There are so many times, for example, where you will fight the exact same boss spread across multiple dungeons, each with similar movesets and styles, and while these things are all completely optional, especially on second or third playthroughs, you start to see how in some spots, quantity took precedence over quality. Sure, each zone in Elden Ring is awe-inspiring in scale, but once you start to dig into every corner and hidden passageway, so many reused assets and enemies become apparent, and the facade starts to break down. In contrast, if you play something like Dark Souls, Sekiro, or Bloodborne, because of their more linear nature, everything feels deliberate and meaningful. You know that no matter where you go, the things you find will be fully thought out and deserving of your undivided attention. And on top of this, because of the open world nature of Elden Ring, you lose some of the better pacing of previous FromSoft titles, which can potentially result in hours wasted going through pointless side dungeons that aren't actually the best content possible. To be fair though too, these dungeons are still fun and provide unique rewards, and as I mentioned before, because Elden Ring has such a grand scale, it really does make the adventure feel more expansive and memorable in a way. But speaking of memorable, another thing I've grown to actually dislike is how Elden Ring handles lore. When I originally played the game, because it was my first time playing a FromSoft title, I hadn't seen any stories told in quite the same way. It was so cool how I understood almost nothing, and how you had to read item descriptions and murals on the wall to try and piece together the insane lore of the past. After all, most of my favorite worlds in gaming are home to largely mysterious places with tons of unanswered questions. And in essence, Elden Ring itself is just one big mashup of all of those things I like. But in retrospect, once again, after playing more and watching tons of YouTube videos on the lore of the game, I've actually begun to not like it at all. Weird and strange or unexplainable lore is cool, but when your game's story and past is told in such purposely esoteric and hard to understand ways, it comes off as almost pretentious rather than cool. Or in other words, having some mystery is fun, but that mystery needs to be grounded in something that feels real and tangible. In Elden Ring's case, literally everything about the lore, the characters, and the world is just so overbearing and cumbersome to even try to understand. I would watch watch literal 1 hour long videos explaining the most mundane things about the lore in Elden Ring. And sure, by the end of it, it made a little more sense, but then you would watch again and realize how many assumptions are just being made, how much bullshit is being intertwined with facts, and more than anything, the feeling that Elden Ring is just trying to be hard to understand just for the sake of it. I appreciated this fact at first because I assumed it was all growing towards something that would make full sense and be more interesting. But after diving down the lore rabbit hole for over a year after the game's initial release, I finally have just come to the conclusion that the lore for this game on the most part sucks, at least for me. And by the way, that's coming from someone who has done over 50 hours of YouTube video content on game lore for tons of different series. Trust me, even once you understand the lore behind Elden Ring just a little bit, it's just kind of boring and weird for no other reason than the writers and designers to pat themselves on the back for how cool their game is, in my opinion. So much so that it often feels like the FromSoft writers just sat in a room and laughed, coming up with crazy ideas, and then tried to figure out how to make them be obscure as possible, which in turn would cause the community to hallucinate tons of random things that only might be true. The lore is so confusing, really anyone can make up any story or explanation for anything and find a way to make it make sense. And when your world building becomes this obscure, in my opinion, you're doing something wrong. I loved it at first, but now I've lessened in that appreciation greatly. And overall, lessening in my appreciation is essentially the story of my journey with Elden Ring. Even in the DLC itself, the zone seems so expansive for no reason at times, with countless dead ends, and in the base game, the final third act feels so rushed, with bosses that are as easy as they come and less attention to detail. I distinctly remember even on my first playthrough getting to the wintry mountaintops and just letting out a sigh knowing I had so much of a game left that I thought was almost over. The thing is though, even despite all that, Elden Ring is truly still one of the greatest games ever made, and without a doubt a triumph in the gaming industry. It's just that in retrospect, when I think back on my own personal time with this title, while I did enjoy it, not only do I not want to ever go back to this world, but I've started to notice more and more of the issues in it. And maybe for some people, they either love these so-called issues and look past them or actually find them as a net positive. But for me, I think in the future, I will look back at Elden Ring as a great game I played and enjoyed, and something I'm proud of beating, but not an experience I really want to undergo ever again by any measure. I don't know if you guys are the same way, but for me, I'm constantly in search of games that are more than just fun, more than just a time sink, but instead experiences that last with us forever. And that's why going into playing Outer Wilds originally, I was beyond excited. I had heard the game was something really special, and at its core was a journey unlike any other out there, where every day you wake up to find yourself in a universe with only 22 minutes left until the sun goes supernova and everything dies, only for you to awake once again with little time to save the galaxy. It's an amazing premise, but one that when I finished my first playthrough and felt almost nothing at all, I was devastated. This was a game that was practically made for me. Sci-fi, eccentric, contemplative, and meaningful. It hit all the marks I was looking for, and yet I had so many problems with it. I didn't like how the puzzles you solved in the game were so rigid and lacked the ingenuity and agency of something like, say, Prey, my second favorite game of all time, rest in peace Arcane. And because I had rushed my way through the main story in order to figure out what happened, I missed so much. It was cool flying between different planets and discovering secrets, but the way I played the first time was trying to piece these hints together as quickly as possible and getting frustrated anytime I had to try something new and the game's pacing came to a halt. So honestly, I came away thinking Outer Wilds was beyond overrated, and to a certain extent, maybe it still is. After all, the fan base for this title knows no bounds to its love. But if I'm being honest, in retrospect, and after coming back to this game after some time, along with a new mindset, it really is, in a way, quite magical. Sailing through the stars, especially when you don't know what's out there yet, provides a feeling of exploration unmatched by any other game. And when the music kicks in just right as you make your way through a tornado of water on a creepy planet, or a black hole swallowing a figment of space piece by piece, it becomes perfectly clear why this title is so beloved. When I was replaying this game for the second time and taking things slower, I at one point stumbled upon a strange NPC hidden away in the corner of one of the planets, playing an instrument and looking into the night sky, simply humming a tune that for eternity carried on, cycle from cycle. And it's moments like these that make you realize what Outer Wilds is all about. out. This isn't a game you should try to finish as fast as possible like I did at first. It's one where you're encouraged to take your time, explore, and at your own pace unravel the mysteries of the universe itself. And boy, what an amazing ending this game has as well. Originally when I first played, I got an ending where everyone died and I uncovered some secrets as to what was really going on. But if you take your time and go even deeper, you can find endings that I would consider some of the most beautiful in gaming history, and make you question not only the game and its meaning, but also the meaning of life and beauty altogether. And as boring as Outer Wilds can be at times, if I'm being honest, as frustrating as it was my first time around, over a year later, and after giving it another shot, I finally get it. I get why it's such a darling in the industry, considered by many the greatest indie game ever made, and by some, the greatest game full stop. Because even though it certainly isn't my personal favorite, and like I mentioned, I still do have a handful of gripes with the experience, and things I think a potential sequel could do to make it almost perfect, all of which I talked about in my Outer Wilds review, by the way. In retrospect, what an amazing game Outer Wilds 1 really is. I'll admit it, I was wrong. Outer Wilds isn't nearly as overrated as I originally thought, and truly is home to some of the most unique and unforgettable journeys in a game I've ever gone on. Without a doubt, a title I've completely changed my mind on, and we have a lot more where that came from. If you guys have been watching my channel for a while now, you know that there are a select few games on this channel that are beloved by the gaming community at large that I simply don't like. Some of these include titles like Hollow Knight, which I absolutely ripped to shreds in my least popular video of all time that tons of people watching disagreed with vehemently, and I stand by everything I said there. But other games I hated on, after playing more and giving multiple playthroughs, I've come around to. And one of the best examples of this is Disco Elysium. Originally when I first played the title, engaging with it for any more than 30 minutes would make me feel fatigued out of pure boredom. While I found the writing interesting at times, it was also so pretentious for pretentious sake. And the actual gameplay, if you could even call it that, was so mundane I would have rather just watched a movie about the same premise. And to top it all off, my initial impressions of all of the characters were that they were all very dry and unrelatable. Kim's monotone voice and presentation felt like an art student's obsession with depressed people and the meaninglessness of life come to fruition, and the actual unnamed character I played as at the start of the game was a sad, sorry drunk who had no redeeming qualities. And as if things couldn't get any worse too, the setting of the story, Revachol, was even more unbearable than the characters themselves, and included pretty much nothing I was interested in at all. Socialist and communist bloc countries and their political intrigue, while fascinating in their own right, are about the only section of the entire history of mankind I struggle to find any joy or interest in at all. But while that's a very personal opinion that many others might not share, what was undeniable was that Disco Elysium was a slow game, and one I most definitely was not enjoying at all. I even gave the title a couple of tries too, over 4 in fact, where in each subsequent run I got further and further but never fell in love. That was until the 5th and final time I finally tried this beloved indie icon, where it finally started to click for me. Because this time around I told myself I was going to give this strange game one more try, at the suggestion of so many of my viewers, and really take my time to listen to every bit of dialogue, engage with as many systems as I could, and explore places I hadn't been. And I'm so glad I did. Because you see, as funny as it sounds, I actually still don't like Disco Elysium all that much. But after finally completing it and doing all of the side missions, I get why so many do. There are a variety of awesome side quests and moments in this game, like where you find a ghost upstairs and it turns out to be a young innocent woman, or stumbling upon a truly paranormal event in a church that cascades into coming into contact with some utterly eerie people and entities. And throughout all of it, there are tons of hilarious and absurd things that you can say in dialogue that add a lot of much needed intrigue and comedy to the script. Early on, for example, there are a lot of funny moments like talking to a girl in the hotel room beside yours and immediately failing at flirting. But these moments become so much better once you get the context much later on of what really happened and who these people are. Because in Disco Elysium, you take on the role of a drunk cop who blacked out the night before so hard that he forgot who he was, on a journey to solve a murder that occurred in the very same place you're staying. And this means early on, things are so confusing. You have no connection to anyone, no idea of where anything is, and everything is at least partially a confusing mess on purpose. And it's that mess and trying to reverse it on my first 4 playthroughs that made this such a hard game to love. But once you push through that and start to get to the later half where the pieces all fall together and you uncover much more interesting places and quests, in my opinion, the game gets much better. And while I still find the setting mind-numbingly monotonous, moments like talking to a widow who you've fallen in love with by the beach about life and its meaning and what love even is makes up for it in spades. Without a doubt, Disco Elysium is a game with a lot of heart and situations that really make you think or laugh, just like one of its inspirations, Planescape Torment, did so many years ago. And it's only after I actually played through the whole game and all of the side content that I finally have a newfound appreciation for the experience. And I'm not going to sit here and act like I absolutely adore this game just for those of you watching, because I know I love seeing creators give love to games that I adore, but after finally completing Disco Elysium, I get why the game has the following it does. It's such a unique and almost surreal experience, and one that certainly is not for everyone, but if you can get past that initial block of bad gameplay, a boring world, and systems like a time mechanic which can be infuriating, you are left with something truly beautiful at the inside of it all. Full of characters that are much deeper than they originally seem, moments that will make your heart sing or your brain question, and RPG mechanics that revolutionize the genre and tie into your character build and choice and consequence perfectly. Certainly not a game I will be recommending non-stop in my videos like say Prey and Cyberpunk, as a lot of you know, but one that I have immense respect for now, and it's sad to see we may never get another game quite like it.